In just 52 seconds, $8.7 billion into bureaucratic silence. Kash Patel didn't expect the attack. He didn't prepare for the precision. Cameras captured everything. The Senate chamber froze. What did Senator Patty Murray uncover that made America's most powerful law enforcement director admit he had no plan, no timeline, and no answers for the missing money meant to protect 330 million Americans? At exactly 2:47 p.m., in the Hart Senate Office Building, Room 19-2, the mahogany walls seemed to close in as Senator Patty Murray shuffled through her meticulously prepared notes. The Committee on Appropriations hearing on FBI oversight had started routinely enough. Standard questions about operational efficiency, standard deflections about classified matters, but Murray, a 33-year veteran of the Senate, had spent weeks digging through federal budget documents, uncovering discrepancies that would make headlines within the hour. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows created sharp shadows across the witness table, where FBI Director Kash Patel sat, adjusting his navy tie for the third time in 10 minutes. Behind him, 3 FBI advisors whispered frantically among themselves, their faces etched with the kind of concern that suggests they knew something terrible was about to unfold. Patel had walked into that hearing room like an investigator who had seen too many lies, his characteristic confidence masking what his staff privately called preparation gaps. The 44-year-old director carried himself with the swagger of someone who had built his career on exposing others' weaknesses, never imagining he would become the target. His briefing folder, thick with talking points about successful operations and crime statistics, sat unopened on the mahogany table. The irony would become apparent soon enough. The man who had made his name investigating government corruption was about to be exposed for his own administrative failures. Murray began with surgical precision, her voice cutting through the chamber's tension, like a prosecutor opening a case she knew she could win. "Director Patel," she said, her Seattle accent lending a no-nonsense edge to each word, "I want to start with something very simple, very basic, very fundamental to your job. Where is the fiscal year 2026 budget request for the Federal Bureau of Investigation?" The question hung in the air for exactly 4 seconds, long enough for Patel's confident expression to flicker, long enough for the C-SPAN cameras to capture that first moment of uncertainty that would be replayed millions of times across social media. "It's, being worked on, ma'am," Patel replied, his voice carrying none of the authority expected from someone who commanded 35,000 federal employees and a budget approaching $10 billion annually. Murray leaned forward, her gray hair catching the overhead lighting, as she fixed Patel with the kind of stare that had intimidated senators, cabinet secretaries, and presidents over 3 decades. "Being worked on by whom? Director. You've been in office for 8 months. This request was due to Congress on February 15th. Today is March 8th. That's 3 weeks overdue." She paused, letting the mathematics sink in. "Have you reviewed this mystical budget that's supposedly being worked on?" Patel's hands, which had been resting confidently on the table, began a subtle drumming pattern against the wood. "Not yet, ma'am. I'm working with my interagency partners to finalize the details." The phrase interagency partners would become a running joke on late-night television within hours, but in that moment it landed like a confession of bureaucratic incompetence. "Interagency partners," Murray repeated slowly, her voice dripping with the kind of skepticism that comes from decades of watching officials dodge accountability. "Mr. Patel, you are the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You report directly to the Attorney General. Your budget request doesn't require interagency coordination. It requires leadership." She opened a manila folder with theatrical precision. "Let me help you understand what your job actually requires. Every federal agency head must submit detailed budget justifications, including personnel costs, operational expenses, technology upgrades, and strategic initiatives. Where are yours?" The silence that followed stretched for 18 seconds, an eternity in congressional hearings, a lifetime in political careers. Patel attempted a recovery, straightening in his chair and adopting the tone that had served him well in previous confirmations. "Senator, I can assure you that the FBI continues to operate at peak efficiency. We've made significant arrests, seized record amounts of illegal drugs, and protected Americans from numerous threats. But Murray was having none of it, her preparation evident as she cut through his deflection, with laser-focused precision. "Director, I didn't ask about your operation, I asked about your budget. These are different things. One requires law enforcement skills. The other requires basic management competence." The assembled press gallery stirred audibly, sensing blood in the water. Then came the revelation that would dominate news cycles for weeks. Murray opened a second folder, this one marked with red tabs indicating classified briefing materials. "Director Patel, according to documents provided by your own financial management division, the FBI has lost approximately 1,900 employees since 2023. That's nearly 2,000 trained federal agents, analysts, linguists, and support staff, who are no longer protecting America." She paused for effect, watching Patel's face drain of color. "Can you explain to this committee how you plan to maintain national security with a workforce that's been decimated by nearly 6%? Patel's response came in stammers and half-sentences. "Well, Senator, we're implementing efficiency measures, streamlining operations, focusing on core mission priorities." Murray interrupted with the kind of authority that comes from knowing you hold all the cards. "Director, efficiency measures don't replace human beings. When you lose 1,900 employees, you lose 1,900 sets of eyes watching for threats, 1,900 minds analyzing intelligence, 1,900 professionals protecting our children from predators and our businesses from cybercriminals." Her voice rose slightly, not in anger, but in the measured intensity of someone making a point that could not be ignored. "And you're telling this committee that you don't even have a budget to address these staffing shortfalls?" Patel's advisors behind him were now frantically passing notes, their whispered consultations creating a background buzz that the chamber's sensitive microphones picked up and broadcast to C-SPAN's national audience. The numbers Murray cited next would spark congressional investigations within days. "Director, let's talk about money. The FBI's baseline budget for fiscal year 2025 was $10.7 billion, but according to the Treasury Department's expenditure reports, your actual spending through the first quarter was only $2.1 billion. Where is the remaining $8.6 billion? Patel shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence now completely evaporated. "Senator, those funds are allocated across multiple quarters, and some expenditures are classified." But Murray was relentless. "Mr. Patel, I sit on the Intelligence Committee. I have clearance for classified expenditures. I'm not talking about black budgets or covert operations. I'm talking about basic operational funding that should be transparently reported to Congress." What happened next would be dissected by political scientists for years to come. Murray reached into her briefcase and produced a single sheet of paper, holding it up like a prosecutor presenting murder weapon evidence. "Director, this is a memorandum from your own Assistant Director for Finance, dated February 28, 8 days ago. It states, and I quote, 'The Director has not reviewed, approved or provided guidance on any budget submissions for fiscal years 2025 or 2026. The chamber erupted in murmurs as reporters frantically scribbled notes. "Your own financial officer is telling Congress that you haven't done your job. How do you respond to that?" Patel's jaw clenched visibly, his hands now gripping the edge of the witness table. "Senator, that memorandum was taken out of context." "Out of context?" Murray's voice carried a note of genuine surprise. "Director, it's a yes or no question. Have you reviewed your agency's budget requests for the past 2 fiscal years?" The pause that followed lasted exactly 52 seconds, long enough for every camera in the room to capture Patel's complete loss of composure, long enough for his legal background to remind him that lying to Congress is a federal crime, long enough for him to realize that his career might be ending in real time. I have not completed a full review of all budget documents," he finally admitted, his voice barely audible through the chamber's sound system. Murray leaned back in her chair with the satisfaction of a chess master, delivering checkmate. "Director Patel, you've been in office for 8 months. You oversee an agency with 35,000 employees and a budget approaching $11 billion. You are responsible for protecting America from terrorism, espionage, cybercrime, and organized crime, and you're testifying under oath that you haven't reviewed your own budget." She paused, letting the magnitude of that admission settle over the room. How exactly do you plan to protect the American people when you don't know how much money you have or how it's being spent? Patel attempted one final deflection. Senator, I've been focused on operational priorities, ensuring that our agents in the field have the resources they need. But Murray cut him off with surgical precision. Director, those agents can't do their jobs without proper funding, equipment and personnel, all of which require budget planning, all of which require leadership, all of which you've apparently neglected for 8 months, while collecting a $180,000 annual salary to do exactly that job. The room fell silent, except for the clicking of camera shutters and the scratch of pens on paper. I want a complete budget justification on my desk. Within 72 hours, I want a detailed explanation of where every penny of taxpayer money has gone, and I want your personal assurance that you will fulfill the basic responsibilities of your position, or step aside for someone who will. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within hours, Patel budget scandal was trending on every major social platform. Cable news networks led with breaking coverage of FBI director's budget meltdown. Editorial boards across the country questioned whether someone who couldn't manage basic administrative tasks could be trusted with national security. Conservative commentators who had supported Patel's appointment began distancing themselves from what one called an unforced error of epic proportions. Democratic lawmakers immediately called for Inspector General investigations, while even some Republicans privately acknowledged that Murray had exposed fundamental incompetence. By evening, the White House was fielding questions about whether President Trump still had confidence in his FBI director. Press secretary responses grew increasingly evasive as reporters pressed for specifics about Patel's job security. Congressional leadership from both parties announced plans for additional oversight hearings, with Murray's performance being hailed as a masterclass in government accountability. The senator's office reported receiving thousands of calls and emails from constituents thanking her for holding the FBI accountable, while federal law enforcement unions expressed deep concern about leadership instability at the Bureau. Behind closed doors at FBI headquarters, the mood was reportedly funeral-like, as career agents and administrators grappled with the reality that their director had been publicly humiliated for failing at the most basic aspects of his job. Morale, already strained by staffing cuts and political controversies, plummeted as employees worried about the Bureau's future under leadership that couldn't even manage a budget submission. Senior FBI officials privately admitted that Murray's questions had exposed problems they'd been warning Patel about for months, issues that had been ignored in favor of high-profile arrests and media appearances. The reverberations extended far beyond the Beltway, reaching field offices from Seattle to Miami, where agents faced questions from local law enforcement partners about FBI stability and funding. International allies quietly expressed concerns about sharing intelligence with an agency whose leadership appeared incompetent at basic administration. Intelligence officials from friendly nations began requesting meetings to discuss continuity of operations, diplomatic language for determining whether the FBI could be trusted with sensitive information. Legal experts pointed out that Patel's admitted negligence in budget oversight could trigger various federal accountability measures, from Inspector General investigations to potential criminal referrals, if evidence of financial mismanagement emerged. The Government Accountability Office announced plans for a comprehensive audit of FBI finances, while the Office of Personnel Management indicated it would review staffing decisions that had led to the loss of nearly 2,000 employees. Ethics watchdogs filed formal complaints alleging that Patel had violated his oath of office by failing to properly steward taxpayer resources. As news of the hearing spread internationally, foreign media outlets covered the story as evidence of declining American institutional competence. The BBC's analysis noted that the FBI director's apparent inability to manage basic administrative functions raises questions about U.S. law enforcement capabilities. Deutsche Welle reported that America's premier investigative agency appears leaderless at a critical time for global security. Even allied intelligence services began reconsidering operational partnerships with an organization whose director couldn't answer basic questions about funding and staffing. The political ramifications proved equally devastating. Murray's surgical dismantling of Patel became required viewing in communications and political science courses across the country, studied as an example of how preparation and persistence could expose government incompetence. Her questioning technique, methodical, fact-based, relentless, became the gold standard for congressional oversight. Within weeks, other committee chairs were adopting her approach, demanding detailed documentation before hearings and refusing to accept vague deflections from executive branch officials. Perhaps most damaging was the revelation that Patel's failures weren't isolated incidents, but part of a pattern of administrative neglect that had been building since his appointment. Murray's questions had merely scratched the surface of what investigators would later describe as systematic abandonment of basic management responsibilities. The 52 seconds of silence that preceded Patel's admission became a symbol of government dysfunction, replayed endlessly, as evidence of what happens when political appointments prioritize loyalty over competence. The immediate future looked grim for both Patel and the FBI. Congressional oversight intensified, with Murray's committee scheduling weekly hearings until all budget questions were answered. The Justice Department's Inspector General launched multiple investigations into financial management, staffing decisions, and administrative procedures. Media scrutiny reached levels typically reserved for cabinet secretaries during major scandals, and through it all, the fundamental question Murray had raised remained unanswered. How could Americans trust an FBI that couldn't even manage its own budget? The hearing that was supposed to be routine oversight had become a reckoning, exposing not just one man's failures, but broader questions about government accountability and institutional competence. Murray's 52 seconds of patient silence had given Patel enough rope to hang himself professionally, and his admission of administrative negligence would echo through the corridors of power for years to come. Sometimes the most devastating political moments aren't dramatic confrontations or angry exchanges. They're quiet admissions of failure, captured on camera and broadcast to a nation that expects better from its public servants. In the end, those 52 seconds of silence spoke louder than any speech, any investigation, or any partisan attack ever could. They were the sound of accountability finally catching up with incompetence, of preparation defeating deflection, and of one senator's refusal to accept excuses for inexcusable failures. The FBI might survive Patel's leadership, but his reputation never recovered from the moment he admitted to a United States senator that he simply hadn't done his job.